Are we all rolling?
Yeah.
So if I was like, a good way to start the podcast would be like this. A Church of the Highlands College graduate, and a ex-Pentecostal, cage-stage Calvinist, curly wearing a hard hat, and a Church of Christ preacher walking to a bar.
Not just a hard hat disguised as a normal hat.
Yeah.
Oh, I definitely got Timberlands on.
With the Timbs on.
Blue collar.
They grab some tea and they sit down to record a podcast.
Yeah.
That is, look, how we have all ended up here. I mean, my way is kind of traditional. I
You
grew
just
up,
never left.
yeah,
Providential.
via, sort of Baptist seminary. That's my only oddity. Peyton, you've been all over the map.
I've been at Honda and in a blender. I've been in a blender.
Well, you've been a blender of churches too, right? Your past involves all sorts of churches. You were here when you were real young,
Yeah.
and then you.
So what all denominations or church types have you been to?
So I've been to just your plain Southern Baptist churches. I've been to your Church of Christ around the area. I've been to churches that don't like being categorized as a denomination. I've been to a lot of different. I've been to Pentecostal churches that are like hyper charismatic.
Did you ever consider yourself Pentecostal? Was there any point in your life where you would have called yourself Pentecostal?
Yeah, so
charismatic.
I grew up in a very uncharismatic environment,
Yeah.
if that's what I would say about it. And
Pendulum swing situation.
yeah, so I thought, this got to be this. And then the next thing you know, I end up in a church and they're doing snow angels on the floor.
Was there snow there?
Nope. And they were
Spirit
just laughing
angels.
hysterically.
Spirit angels. Oh, the laughter. We're going to talk about that in one of the weeks to come, I think. We're going to talk about some Holy Spirit stuff. And we're in a tradition that has, unfortunately, de-emphasized the Holy Spirit for a lot of years. And there are many traditions that overemphasize the gifts of the Spirit, kind of doing exactly what Paul was talking about not to do in 1 Corinthians 13 and 14 and those things. And, the Bible isn't particularly clear on, I think, the lines we can draw on what's still happening, what's not happening. I'm a little more cautious in that area. But it is clear about some things, about how those things work. We're going to talk about that in weeks to come, I think. Maybe you can come back for that one. Today, though, we are talking about the topic of worship in general, and then why us weirdos, Church of Christ folks, don't use instruments, which is probably the most common question I get, at least the one before, do you think I'm going to help? But do you feel like that's the most common questions about instruments when it comes to Church of Christ stuff?
I went to Church of the Highlands for several years, like 7 or 8 years. I went to their college
More
and
than just went, like you were kind of
yeah,
working.
served in a high role, not on staff, but served is in kind of a youth minister role for several years in 2 different campuses, and technically a small group leader, but it was a small group in one campus of 280 kids, and the other one it was 160 or something. So was very much involved and still love that church. We ended up back here at Ohatchee really through the children's ministry because our kids preferred the children's ministry here. And so that brought us kind of back over here. But yeah, the worship there is very contemporary, and whenever people would find out that I was from Church of Christ, they couldn't believe that I'd ended up there. And the first question was always, you guys are the ones that don't use instruments, right? And I was like, yeah. So you think that we're going to hell because you use instruments? I was like, no. And I don't think that most Church of Christ would say that. Yeah. But I said, no, it's a preference thing. Just like this style of worship is a preference thing. And I prefer to worship with instruments personally, but ultimately it ultimately came down to the fact that wasn't the guiding factor in terms of choosing a church. And that came with just kind of changing what my perspective of worship was in general, like what worship actually meant.
Yeah, so that's good, and we'll get to the kind of Church of Christ stuff in particular in a little bit. But when you think of worship in general, what does that mean, and maybe how do we kind of sometimes tend to think about it wrongly in the popular church, or the idea of what is worship?
Yeah, when I think about the word worship, at least in a little bit of study that I've done, I found that there's a misunderstanding about it, that it's kind of like this, where we are sort of like a concert almost, like that idea. But the word worship, I'm thinking of Romans 12:1, where I think about this idea of offering your body like as a living sacrifice. This is your true and spiritual worship.
Yeah.
So when I think about the word worship, at least what I think about is not just what we do here, but what we do with every minute of our life.
Yeah, so broader than just singing, broader than just that time of singing, and that's it's not all maniacal, like there's an evil plans, but we've just come to the place where when we say worship, that's what people think of, right? You think of the singing part of church, you think of the instrument part of church. We say we're gonna worship, and then we're gonna have a sermon, as if the sermon isn't also worship. We're gonna pray and then worship. Yeah.
And praying.
Yeah. Certainly the idea of worship biblically is at least that what we do here is all worship. But like Peyton's saying, the offering your body as a living sacrifice, this is your pleasing, acceptable worship to God. That everything we do is worship. Right? The whole idea of eating and drinking to the glory of God. When I eat, if I'm doing it rightly, I'm eating worshipfully and glorifying God as I do so. Even eating and drinking, nothing more boring and monotonous and physical and non-churchy than eating and drinking. But even that is intended to be worship. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about too. Is that my idea of how important the style of singing was changed when my philosophy on worship changed. So to me, it's even though I have and I think everybody has preferences of how they would like their church to be run.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the foundational thing for me, or the foundational belief for me, is where can I go where I can worship in my entire life, in truth, and it doesn't really matter as much to me about what that looks like from a performance, or maybe performance is a bad word, but from a Sunday morning, perspective.
Yeah. So that philosophy change in your mind of your philosophy about what worship is and the place it holds and those things. How would you sum up that sort of change? Your philosophy about worship. In that sense, what was that change like?
It went from worship being solely, like if I were to say worship, I meant specifically congregational singing together. Mm-hmm. So you have a worship leader who leads the worship, and you have the worship songs, and you sing the worship songs together, and together when you sing the worship songs with the worship leader, you are worshiping. Mm-hmm. And so, and the problem that poses, I think, is that it makes it so that, one, it's very difficult to worship unless you have the things that you need for worship, unless you have a worship leader and a place, right, and all this. Yeah. But then also it puts the emphasis on an emphasis on the event rather than the life of the person worshiping. So really, I mean, it just shifted everything, because it took the responsibility, I think, for worship out of the hands of the church and the people that were on stage, and put it in my hands daily, not just on Sunday or Wednesday or when we had a special worship service or whatever. Sort
of like put flesh on it for you. And I think just something he was saying, it sparked something in me. I think this sort of the same thing has happened with me, at least as I've come to understand what worship is in I think a better sense, a more God-glorifying sense, is that it gives you freedom to live for God, but not to do so like out of an obligation. Like it's not like you're not like really bound by like a legalistic code. You're still bound by rules, but for the relationship to work, there are rules. But at least currently, when I think about worship now, I think about this offering your body as a living sacrifice in view of God's mercy, like in view of how good God has been to us. This is just the natural response that a person would have out of a heart that loves God. So it's, like Caleb said, it's really softened, I think, maybe a dogmatic tendency that I had of, if you're not doing it this way, then you're not doing it right. If you're not doing it that way, then you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I mean, you try to draw lines about, well, they worship this way, I worship this way, my worship way is right. When instead, the biblical view more is, well, the Christian is one who worships. Right? It's almost a way to define the Christian. That the Christian is the one who loves the Lord and so worships in everything. His life is a life of worship. Caleb's talking about a thing about John 4 when Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, and she's trying to defer her away from her sins. And she says, "Who's right? Do I worship at this mountain like the Samaritans teach, or do I worship in Jerusalem like the Jews teach?" And Jesus uses that phrase that there will come a day where you will not worship here or there, where people will worship in spirit and truth. And meaning that it's not primarily, like Caleb's saying, about this locational thing, but it's the way that the Christian lives. The Christian lives in spirit and truth. The Christian lives with the eyes upward, the eyes on God about everything, in all of our domains, not just our church domain. But there are times when people in the Old Testament particularly are said to go to worship, meaning going to the assembly of the people of God. So there is something there that's good for us to think about. Something that's good for that's higher in some sense in the ecclesia and the assembly that we do each week. But here's question two is question one: what is worship? Question two: why does God, kind of looking at that eventful worship, singing part? We do that every Sunday. Every church around the world, or just about all of them, part of our gathering is singing. That's weird. Why does God command us to sing? Right? That's a weird thing, to command someone to sing. Why not just gather each Sunday and hear the word preached? Why not speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual words? Why not just read the word together, pray together? Singing seems odd. Like there's no other avenue in your life where you get together with people and sing. That's not happening. And maybe if you're in England and you go to a soccer game and there's some chants that are kind of like singing at the crowd, which are almost church-like.
It's worship.
Yeah, it is. It's a different kind. It's a good example of worship. And so it's like singing does have this sort of tied-inness with worshipfulness. But why do you think? What are some ideas that come to mind about why God says, okay, one of the things I want my people to do each week together, as we gather, when we gather, is sing? Because it is particularly a gathering thing, right? Obviously, you sing in your car, you sing Christian music wherever you go, but it's a particular thing that happens when we are gathered, that we are singing to one another. That's the emphasis. Singing to one another when we gather. Why do you think it's important to God that we sing, that singing is a part of our normal worshipful pattern?
Well, I mean, there's something. It seems like there's something spiritual about music, because it impacts you in different ways. I mean, if you think about, and we do this with, you do this with video, but if you want people to feel an emotion while they're listening to a video, you can put a little tune behind it. Yeah, you put some music behind it, and depending on the music, you can change the entire feeling.
Isn't that incredible?
So it deals with you
reality.
without lyrics. Yeah, so it is. And so I've been talking to students. I do student ministry here, and I've been talking to students a lot about how we're made in the image of God, and God created us in order to worship Him. And so the things that move us, it's not accidental that music moves us. It's not accidental that we enjoy praise, that we get a dopamine kick from praising. It's built into us because of what we were built to do, which is worship God. So I think it's mysterious what music does to us in one sense, but in another sense, if you're looking at it from a Christian worldview and from a worldview of God the Creator, it makes sense because that's what He wants us to do.
Yeah.
What's weirder to me, I think, is that I'm not sure. Well, maybe weird is the wrong word, but what's weird to me is that people, even if you don't believe in God or go to church, still want to gather and sing. I mean, look at concerts.
Yeah, right.
People gather like crazy for concerts.
Right.
And then the other side of it that's weird to me is that songs are easier to remember than anything else in our lives. Like I was riding with my kids the other day, and I put on VeggieTales, which is a show I haven't watched since I was in elementary school. So I'm 32, right? And it was like the hair or tie him up and beat him up and throw him out of Babylon. Yeah, and there were some bangers. First of all,
Man, VeggieTales killed it, man.
very impressed with the production quality, but yeah, like the Hairbrush song came on, which is silly, but it's silly songs are hilarious. The Sabu song, I don't know if you remember Sabu. We'll listen to that later. Yeah. Well, not a buffalo, it's a Sabu. You're thinking about Water Buffalo, but all these different songs came on, and I knew them, like I was singing them, and I haven't heard them in 20 years. And so I think too that there's a part of it that most of Scripture I know is tied to a hymn.
Yeah, and that's a good. a couple of main things there. The idea of remembering is a profoundly biblical thing, right? In the Old Testament, they are given songs to teach their children, and it even says things like the song will confront you with the truth. The songs that we pass in generation was the way they passed the truth down, because God knew before we knew all that word that singing was a great mnemonic device that helped us remember things. And yes, we certainly see that in our own lives. Like a song come on you haven't heard in 20 years on the radio, and you're singing it, and it's hard to understand. And so, like we have all the Psalms, of course, which are songs in the Bible, and all these things that were remembered, that were song forms. Certainly a key thing to remember, to help us remember. Which, by the way, is one of those reasons we should be very careful what we're singing, because people don't walk around quoting my sermons on Sundays. Right? People walk around their house singing what we sang on Sundays. And so what are they singing? Are they singing what is true? One of the reasons we should be really careful about what we're saying. A lot of songs we sang for a long time, they were either meaningless, like where we're taking up time at the church to sing things that don't mean anything. There's some examples of that. Back trying to get you a load, or whatever it is. Or just singing things that were just almost heresy. But there is that mnemonic part of singing. But the part of how it affects us emotionally, to me, is so hard to understand and hard to overestimate. Because you're right, like if you put a sad song behind a video of some puppies, and now you're giving money to puppies and you don't know why it happened. Right? That music does something to you as if it was made to do that. And I think it was.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and think about like Saul and David. You know, David, the author of many of our Psalms and our Psalter. The Psalms do something emotionally to us as Christians. And, you know, obviously that's why Paul would say we're to admonish one another with psalms and hymns and spirits, because there's a sort of admonishment that we get and encouragement that we get through our hard times when we sing those truths and codify those truths into our hearts. But what I'm thinking of specifically to kind of jump on what you guys are saying, do you remember Saul when he had like this sort of like oppression, like demonic thing going on, and David played the instrument and it sort of eased him? So I mean, I think even there's probably something biblical to be said about what they do.
Yeah, that's good. And like we know now, like if I say the words "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee," that something different actually happens in my brain than when I sing "Rock of Ages." The same words, that singing it actually does something differently. A different part of my brain lights up, right? Which ties into that. Like there's something emotional that's happening in me that's not happening when I just say the words. And so look, I'm a preacher, right? I speak. I don't sing, and everyone knows it. I mean, I do, unfortunately, on Sundays to the people that are around me. But I'm all about preaching the word and speaking the word. But it's, I think, undeniably true that singing the words tends to sink them more deeply. And the idea, I don't know who I heard it from or read it from, but that music, that singing, opens up the heart so that whatever the words are that you're singing, whatever the messages that you're singing, will sink into the heart. Another reason why we need to be so careful of what we're saying. And I think that's true, that when I say Rock of Ages, cleft for me, I do my best as a preacher to try to help people feel the emotion of those words. But singing does that automatically. Right? The singing just does it. You just feel, when you're paying attention to the words, you feel what it means, that the Rock of Ages, the eternal one, was cut open so that I may hide myself in him. It's profound. And like you're saying, it's just something that you see it in our humanity, that God has made us that way. He has made us to respond emotionally to those things. And yeah, it seems like, I think Jonathan Edwards said, it's hard to make sense of why God commanded us to sing, except that music tends to stir our affections in a way that prose cannot. And I think that's true, that singing, my emotions are stirred much more naturally, at least, by music and by singing than they are by the spoken word, than even by preaching.
The memory thing's huge too. I mean, like, anytime there's a song, like even like my 2-year-old, my 3-year-old, how can they sing their ABCs?
Yeah.
And how do they not know the difference in L, M, N, O, P? Like, it's just L, M, N, O, P.
Yeah,
like,
right.
it's a
One word.
It's just codified into who they are. Like, they know the ABCs.
Yeah.
Too.
You mentioned Ephesians 5 a minute ago, and Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3 are called places that Church of Christ go to a lot, but it's singing to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. But one of the key things is that the reason we come to sing primarily is for each other. right? We sing in some sense to God, but those verses are talking about us singing to one another and singing for one another. It's inherently communal, and so there is this qualitative difference between when you sing in your car by yourself. That's a good thing. I've come to weeping singing in my car several times, singing about the Lord. But what we do at the church and with brothers and sisters is qualitatively different. It's different. Now, and I think one of the big mistakes we've made in the modern church is we have made worship, what we call it, coming to worship, where I'm going to go and get my feeling with God. Right? I'm going to go get that feeling that I got last week, hopefully. I'm going to go and have my personal one-on-one time with God. When biblically, the main reason you're coming to sing is I'm coming for you, and you're coming for me. We're coming for each other. And I'm coming to hear you affirm in Christ alone my hope is found. That you are with me in that truth. I'm coming to hear you encourage me with what can wash away my sins, nothing but the blood of Jesus. Right? That we are singing these things, not because God needs to hear our songs or he's bored from another 6 days, but that we desperately need to hear truth from each other. We desperately need to be encouraged by each other. That one of the main ways we are teaching each other, one of the main ways we're encouraging each other is singing to each other.
Another thing that's really incredible about singing is the way it unites while individualizing us as Christians. Right? One of the cool things about being a Christian is that you have a profound individual relationship with God, but it is not separable from the relationship we have with his people. And it's this one thing together. We were talking about in the First John series, the koinonia of God, which is one thing between God and his people. Not God and me, but God and us. And like psychologists talk about singing operating as what they call a hive switch, where like if all of us start talking at the same time, it's chaos. But if all of us sing at the same time, it becomes beautiful. And it's this denying of self to be absorbed into the unifying body. Right, that I maintain my individuality because my voice is different than the other voices, especially when you're singing different parts and stuff. You see that even more. But my individuality does not remain on its own, but becomes part of a greater whole, which is singing one song together to God. Like that's the picture of the Christian story, that God has redeemed us as his bride, and so individually I am God's. But that's only a small part of it. I am joining the song. I'm joining the story of redemption. It's not just my story of redemption. I am joining in the one story, the one song of redemption that's been going on from the foundation of the world. And so it lifts up both our individuality and our collectivity, our community, each time that we sing, which is a powerful thing, I think.
When you think about it too, that's such a powerful truth that, even psychologists have studied, people need to belong. Like there's something to
for sure.
Something to be said about people in this world when they're hurting. They like go to AA, they go to a program, they become part of something to belong to,
right?
Because they feel like they feel like an outlier. And even in sports, like some of the coolest things we do as human beings, some of the best memories that I have were playing football. That camaraderie that came along with being a part of the team, and having a goal.
Yeah, almost like you're made to be part of something bigger than yourself. Yeah, for sure.
And how fitting in God's church that we have an identity, an individual identity that we're Christ, but also a communal identity.
Yeah. That
we're part of this family and that we're on a team. We have the same goal.
That's good. So let me ask y'all this before we move into the instrument talk. What do you think? So it's true that emotions or our emotions are stirred by music, by singing. So what are the dangers of that? What are kind of what should we be cautious about? What is a slippery slope that could lead us into letting our emotions kind of be the driver as opposed to the responder? Any thoughts on that? What are the dangers of the reality that singing and music is so emotional, if that makes any sense?
Go ahead.
Well, attaching, I don't know if I'd call it a danger, but I think a lot of times when you have an emotional experience that's taking place during a specific song, that song, you kind of connect that to that song, and it can be that that the song becomes the savior rather than the savior in that. You seek that song or that experience or that environment again, like say it's a concert. go back to that, need to try to hunt down that feeling.
Yeah, and that's really worship, right? That you're feeling is some sort of worship. And it's the thing I guess maybe I have in mind the most is kind of connected to that first question that we talked about, worship, is I think very often we have defined worship as that feeling I get emotionally when I'm really into a song, right? And so you can go to a big concert that has nothing to do with God, but it's a good concert. They're talented, and you feel something, right? That's why you go. You feel something because of the music, and so you start to say, well, that is what worship is that emotional feeling, or that's what the Spirit is. Like Florida Georgia Line, who everyone knows that I love.
That's satire.
It is satirical. Said in a concert that they grew up Christians, and said in an article, in an interview, that their concerts felt the same as worship did their whole lives to them, right? So they just felt like they were worshiping. No matter how much you like the song "Holy, Holy, Holy," it's still blasphemous and still totally against God and heresy to say it at its weakest form. It's no good. But we've created kind of the danger of allowing worship to be whatever, and this is what we'll talk about in a minute. The danger of allowing church worship to be everything. The danger of that is we start defining worship as that feeling itself, as opposed, like St. Augustine said something like, when I start feeling emotionally in response to the music and not in response to the words I'm singing, I find myself to have sinned. Now, that may be too strong, but there's a warning there I think that's good, that am I being moved when I sing Rock of Ages because it sounds good? When it does, on the days that it does? Or am I being moved because I am remembering the gospel, and I'm seeing myself in Christ? The danger often referred to as emotionalism, right, where the emotion is the goal. And to me, then emotion becomes God, right, becomes the Spirit. The emotion that feeling becomes, and I know I was that way in college, where I was going primarily to feel the thing that I identified as God, or identified as worship. But it became difficult to understand that when I felt the same thing at a good concert. Thoughts?
I think it's the difference between worship as a hobby and worship as a practice, or as a discipline, maybe is a better word. Whereas like when worship's the hobby, or anything you do is a hobby. Like I mountain bike as a hobby, but I haven't mountain biked in a year.
Yeah.
But I do it because I like the way it makes me feel, and it's it's fun to be outside, and I'm looking for some adventure, but I'm not competitive. I'm not trying to it's not a huge part of my life, even though sometimes I wish it was. Whereas if I'm racing, maybe this is a bad analogy, I don't know, but if I'm racing mountain bikes, I'm out there every day whether I feel like it or not. Mm-hmm. I'm riding on the mountain every day because I've got to be ready when the trial comes, when the competition comes. And I think worship works the same way, in that it's easy for worship to be a hobby, in that it's this thing I go do when I need God, when I need to feel the Spirit, or whatever that is. When I need to feel good. But I think true worship is a discipline and a practice where you go in and do it even when you don't feel it.
Yeah. Tell me what y'all think about this statement. It's one I've made before, and maybe it's good, maybe it's not. Tell me what you think. Is and kind of a line to draw between the emotion being the thing I'm aiming at and God being the thing I'm aiming at. Is if you get emotional, and by that I mean you're in tears, you're feeling something deeply. If you get emotional, in general, you should be able to explain why you got emotional, right? So like last week, I was preparing for a sermon 2 weeks ago, and was in here just weeping because of this deep realization of how small I am in reference to God. Who am I, O Lord? That whole line of thinking. And I could tell you why I was weeping and why I was emotional. I think in general, when we feel deep emotion, we should be able to at least give some sort of answer as to why. And if we get to the point where we can't really answer that question, can't really say, well, here's why I'm emotional, and just say, I don't know, I'm just emotional, in reference to spiritual things, then we may be entering problematic territory. What do you think about that? I think when we focus on emotion, often it is bypassing the mind for the sake of emotion, as opposed to going through the mind and allowing the things that we have thought about to sink deeply into our hearts that cause the emotion.
Like I don't know. Initially, what I thought when you said it was, I think it's a great thing that worshiping God can move us in that way to where we do get like really emotional.
Right.
I think it's great that we get really emotional, so long as it's connected to
Truth.
Truth. God glorifying truth.
Yeah.
That He's for us. He's not against us. He's never going to leave us. All those things that we continually need to remind ourselves of. But I think you're onto something, because insofar as it's not connected to that, then what is it?
Yeah. It just becomes the thing that's driving us as opposed to a response to the truth of the word, the truth of the gospel. It seems.
I'm not sure I've ever been emotional from worship without thinking about, without knowing why I was emotional.
I'm not sure that.
But I'm not a very emotional person. I think we've got three men that are pretty similar,
when it comes to
in the room,
emotions.
especially when it comes to emotions. Yeah, and so, I think we're all probably in the same boat of that. I'll normally, if I start feeling emotional, in spiritually or just in the world, if I feel like crying, I will go through a rational argument with myself of whether or not the emotion I'm feeling is worthy of being felt.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much the only thing that ever wins is God and kids, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
God and family are the only thing that ever seem to otherwise it's no, this isn't worth crying over. I don't feel like crying today, so I'm just not going to.
Yeah.
So I think, being analytical, it's hard for me to think about feeling emotional without understanding why, so I think I understand.
Yeah, I mean, you could think about, we spent a week at Bethel, School of Supernatural Ministry in Northern California, and
2012.
long time ago. So whatever, long time ago. And there was what they would refer to as holy laughter, where they're becoming very emotional, and it's not primarily rational, right? So we have that sort of emotional action that's not primarily as a response to rational behavior or rational thinking. And the caution just being to keep ourselves from sliding down into emotionalism, where emotion is the goal of worship. Emotion is the driver, the thing that's calling the shots, as opposed to the feeling that comes along with truth. When truth invades my heart, I become emotional, or I'm looking for emotion, and I'll go find it, whatever it takes. And so it feels like worship when I go to a concert, because to me that's what worship is, as opposed to worship being.
Worship is just an emotion.
Right, if it's just a feeling I get when the music, right? And what I'm saying is that the feeling I get when I hear a good song and good music should be different than the feeling I get when I hear the gospel and it sinks into my heart. Right? I should be able to distinguish between those two and say that's worship, at least in response to worship, and that one is not. And I think we're that line's gotten thinner over the years.
I would touch it, what you were saying, I would touch it in this way. I think that we're always worshiping. At every second of every day.
Worshipful creatures.
And not just believers. I think unbelievers are doing the same.
Mm-hmm.
We're all worshiping, and we're all worshiping something, because that's just what, like Caleb was saying, that's what we're built to do. So even if we're worshiping God, being moved by spiritual truth, or if we're worshiping that emotion, then that's become our God. That emotion itself has become false worship, like an idolatry, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the worship becomes God.
I think it's great that
if you never felt that emotion, or if you never felt the emotion, would you still follow God, right? Or am I here just for the emotion? You know what I mean? Okay, any thoughts on that before we move into the Church of Christ wacko stuff, which is what we are? Thoughts on the emotion stuff? I think it is very good and intended by God that singing and music moves our hearts. I think the primary reason for that is so that truth may sink more deeply in. I think the danger of it is what else will sink in when our hearts are soft. What else are we allowing to sink in through the music? And you'll see that, goodness gracious, the country music theology of Southeast America, right? Where people will say, well, God understands a heart like mine, because they heard that song and it sunk in and they remember it. And you got the mnemonic device, and you got the power of the emotion that comes along with it, and that's what they think about God.
That's the gospel.
right, and like all the not just country music, but all music is indoctrinating us in a way.
What do you mean by country music theology?
Like that line is a Miranda Lambert line.
What is it?
I just lost it, Peyton. God will understand a heart like mine, right? And just she's justifying her sin, saying, "Well, God will understand my heart." And so people take that line of thinking, which is just very basic, kind of surface level, barely Christian thinking. And I should have thought of some more examples before this. Didn't know we'd go here, but and then that becomes what's true, and that ends up trumping anything what some preacher says. The word, yeah, but God understands a heart like mine because that wasn't a song. And there's like this thing when we sing something and it like connects it to our hearts in a permanent way. But if it's true that emotions music softens our hearts and allows things to sink more deeply in. Most of the music we're hearing on a weekly basis is not something we want to be sinking into our hearts or our children's hearts, right? And though it is, there's all these assumptions that I think we are making as a result of the music that we've heard and the songs that we are singing. And like even something as simple as like when all the songs you're hearing are about romance, you think the main reason for life is romance, right? Which the large majority of songs you're going to hear today is about romance. If you find a 17-year-old girl who loves Taylor Swift, she probably thinks that her dating life is everything.
I like Taylor Swift.
She's very talented. But the point being that music tends to indoctrinate us invisibly.
Think of like Larry Fleet too, like another example. He's got a song, it's That's Where I Find God. And basically the central thrust of the song is, I don't go to church, I go to the tree stand.
Yeah.
And of course there's a principle there that's like, it's great
right.
to be in nature, to see what God has made, to see the
yeah.
creation that preaches the gospel. It's a beautiful thing, but it's not church.
Yeah.
Church is something
Yeah.
higher, something we're called to.
Maren Morris sings "This is my church" or "That's my church." Same idea. Like a lot of those kind of songs where it's I don't go to church, but my church is. And there's a lot there where what you mean by my church is the hunting stand, or my church is the highway, is that you feel the thing, right? You feel the peace, you feel the emotion, you feel the thing, you feel what you call God, and of course you feel God when you're out in the woods, and of course you can feel God when you're driving, all those things. But that individual one-on-one thing is not church, right? We have such a small view of church. It's this one-on-one individualized thing so that thing I can do somewhere else. What do I need church for? If that thing is all church is and all God is, even by extension, then I can do it wherever. So we pick up on that. We pick up on that other theology, and that becomes real.
And then I think also with secular music singing about different kinds of church, you have people listen. You reach a lot of people who don't follow the Bible, don't believe in God, or have left the church, and they hear that and think, well, then what's the point of going to church anyway?
Sure, yeah.
If church is everywhere, then church,
Yeah. And so it
weakens the message. I think.
If the majority of our culture is getting their theology primarily from secular music, then at best you end up with shallow theology. At worst, you end up with worse than that. But we had this, as always, God creates something very good, that moving our emotions is a very good thing. But I think there's dangers in the reality that it moves our emotions. Because if things sink into our hearts more deeply when we're moved, we're allowing all sorts of things to sink into our hearts, into the hearts of our children, more than they're hearing on Sunday mornings, even.
And it's such a complex thing, too, because, we need to encourage, especially men in today's environment, sort of this reaction against men being emotional in public. It does a lot for my kids to see me loving God, to see my wife and I feeling emotional because we love God.
Sure.
Like it does something for them. Even when I apologize to them because I raised my voice or something. If I'm emotional, if they can see that Dad's real, he's not an empty shell, he's not a hypocrite, then I think it does a great thing for our kids to see us being vulnerable.
Yeah, we're made to be emotional. It's foolish to think that Christianity is not stoicism. It's not cold. It is warm, heart-stirring, emotion-filled. We are called rejoice. My brothers, I tell you again, rejoice. We are called to mourn with those who mourn. That's a command. We say, well, God doesn't command emotions. He does it all the time. God commands emotions throughout the Bible. We are to rejoice with those who rejoice, to mourn with those who mourn, and all those things that come along with that. And so, we are inescapably emotional, and that's a good thing. But as with all things, there's a danger that comes along with it, I think. We got to be wary of.
So the weirdest part of the Church of Christ
yeah, you stinking weirdos don't use instruments. Why is that?
Not even a piano. That's always
Not
the
even
follow-up.
a piano.
Not even a piano.
We ain't even got an organ in this
think
joint.
we're going to hell?
Yeah, and then that's the third question. That's the follow-up question. If you're in the Church of Christ, you've received these questions before, and if you're watching this channel, then you no doubt have to follow that up with, we're not like the rest of them, because if you're like the rest of them, you don't watch this channel. So yeah, there's a very common series of questions that you get as a Church of Christ goer that go, where do you go to church? Blank space, Church of Christ. And you guys don't use instruments. No, we don't use instruments. Not even a piano. No, not even a piano. Do you think everybody else is going? Do you think I'm going to hell? Yeah, that's crazy. Do you think I'm going to hell? No, I don't think you're going to hell. Also, the church that I go to is not like the Church of Christ that you're probably familiar with.
Yeah.
So just blanket statement. First, we talked about this at the beginning, but I went to a non-denominational church. Was a member at a non-denominational church for a very long time before ending up here at Church of Christ. Peyton's been to basically every denomination in the Southeast. And neither of us would say that, well, I don't know if I can speak for you, but I would not say that what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
Or unbiblical in terms of using instruments and singing songs. Now, just like some of the songs we used to sing, there's some songs we would sing that I would say, man, it's probably not the best message to repeat.
Right.
But that's not exclusive to a certain denomination. That's broadly, we've taken some songs over the decades, millennia, whatever, that were just like, maybe that's probably not, the person that wrote this was very good at writing songs, but not so good at consulting people who knew the scripture.
Yeah.
So why do we use instruments?
Yeah.
Why do we not use
important.
instruments?
Kind of along with that, it's important to understand that Churches of Christ, and it was really kind of the first non-denominational idea, right? The idea was for there not to be another denomination and not to have names like that. That has not turned out that way, and Church of Christ has become more sectarian than any other denomination, and we're certainly a denomination. But it wasn't meant to be that way. But because of that, one of the results of that, one of the good things I think, is that each Church of Christ is entirely independent. So we're not connected in any sort of way, even voluntarily, organized, formal, connected to other churches of Christ. And so you can get very different answers. That's true of all churches. Baptist churches are different. Methodist churches are different. But there are profound differences in churches of Christ. So I really, we can't speak for anybody but Ohatchee Church of Christ. I can tell you I used to go to a church that thought instruments were sinful. How far they would have taken that probably would have differed based on the congregant that you talk to. But those churches do exist. Whether or not that makes you in or out is whatever. I don't know. I was too young to have those sort of thoughts. But those churches do exist. So that's the reason we're getting the questions that come along with that, right? Because those people are there, and obviously that's a pretty strong stance. So Churches of Christ are independent. That's number one. Number two, I don't think there's a biblical case to make that instruments or anything else are sinful. I don't think it's a good case at all. And I'm saying that as the one who used to make it. I don't think it's a strong case at all, which we'll talk about in a second. And then thirdly, we sing without instruments because we think it is the best way, in our opinion, to accomplish what singing is meant to accomplish. Right? The goal of why we are actually meant to sing. It's interesting that it's the idea that we don't use instruments is greeted with such blank stares, because it was the case. Let me speak on the other side for a minute. It was the case from the majority of the history of the church that instruments weren't used. A cappella, which is how we sing, means as the chapel. Right? They were looking at how the Christians were singing, and they sing. That's how the chapel sings. A cappella means as the chapel. It's the way Christians sang for the majority of history. John Calvin, Peyton, said this. He said, "All that's needed is simple and pure singing of the divine praises, coming from heart and mouth, and in the vernacular tongue. Instrumental music was tolerated at the time because of the law, because the people were in their infancy." He also said, "Men who are fond of outward pomp may delight in that noise, but the simplicity which God recommends to us by the apostle is far more pleasing to him. The human voice," Calvin concludes, "assuredly excels all inanimate instruments of music." Martin Luther, in his Luther fashion, called instruments the sign of Baal. Charles Spurgeon said we might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. And most of them were just speaking about an organ, right? They're talking about an organ. And they had strong positions on these things, and some of them ended up using them and softening a bit. But it's not an entirely novel idea that instruments aren't in the church, and it goes back to this old debate between what's called the normative principle and the regulative principle. Normative principle says basically, this was ended up being Luther's position. It says basically, if God doesn't forbid it, then the church has freedom to do it. Normative principle. If God doesn't expressly forbid it, the church has freedom to do it. The regulative principle says the opposite. If God doesn't allow it, the church does not have the ability to do it without God allowing it. Right? If you can't have good reason in the scripture to use it, then you shouldn't be doing it. Now, the position of the Church of Christ is like the strong regulative position, which says there's no New Testament validation for using instruments in church, so we shouldn't use them. Okay, so that's where it comes from. That's the idea. Is since the New Testament doesn't give us, doesn't allow us to use them, doesn't mention using them, we shouldn't be using them. Now, there's a lot of debate on all those things. I don't think that's really true. I think when it talks about psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, that psalms itself necessitates instruments, or at least allows instruments. The psalms certainly had instruments. It's odd that there's so many passages in the Old Testament that are so instrumental and so focused on instruments, and there were instruments in the temple, and even passages in the Old Testament that are foreshadowing the church, talking about instruments. It's a hard and difficult position to hold, but that's the position. Okay, so it is a reasoned out position that says the New Testament doesn't speak of instruments, where the Old Testament talked about them a lot. New Testament changes and says the instruments are inside of you now. Now it's just about singing. And the church did that for millennia, where there was no instruments and all that. Okay, so there is historical background for the church singing a cappella. It is odd to us because of how different things are today, but that's evidence of how quickly things have shifted in the area of worship, right? Church worship used to be very different. The first thing that came in was the organ. That was, again, millennia later. And then we've, in the past 50 years, have moved into basically anything goes. So I don't think the biblical case, we won't get into all that today, I don't think the biblical case is very strong to say that singing is sinful. I don't think it's strong at all. It's mainly an argument from silence. The Bible doesn't mention all kind of things that we do currently, and yet we still do them. But there are reasons that they hold that position, and so we should be graceful towards those that hold that position and disagree with us. Drawing a line of brotherhood seems absolutely insane to me. It's certainly a matter of opinion, Romans 14, it seems. But regardless, there is reason for that. It's also true that congregational singing is the only kind of singing we're ever commanded to do in the New Testament. We are singing together to one another. We're singing to each other. We're singing together. We're meeting together to sing. All the verses about singing in the New Testament are like that. We are to speak the truth about God to each other. Okay, now, with all that, it's very weird today for us as Church of Christ people not to use instruments. If y'all had more time than just an elevator speech with somebody, how do you talk about this thing with people that say, and I say more time, not an hour, but you had 10 minutes, you have 15 minutes, you're sitting down for coffee, and you're going to talk a little bit about why we don't use instruments. How do you answer that question personally? Because we still don't, right? We're still a cappella. We'll be a cappella. We have no intentions of leaving a cappella. We don't use instruments at any of our services, not just Sunday mornings, but that's where we're at. Thoughts on that? How would you tend to answer that question?
I try to do so very gently with immediate qualifications. So I have sort of a bullet point in my head. And the first thing is, we don't think it's sinful.
Yeah.
We don't think there's anything wrong with someone, with their wisdom and the way they do their ecclesiology if they want to do that.
Yeah.
But we do so because we think it best facilitates admonishing one another in this communal thing of singing these truths to one another, to God. So I do so with an immediate, quick bullet point, and a lot of times they're going to ask more questions, and that discussion is going to get deeper, depending on.
Yeah, so I get this question once a week. I'm not
you got a lot of practice.
Genuinely once a week. Coming from a church the church that I came from focuses very heavily on worship. I mean, when you plant, when there's a new plant, one of the first things that happens is you build out your worship team and you set up, the whole kind of kit, and it's all done very well. And even when we were mobile, we met in a school for 6 years, and we would load in all the gear and the full team and all that. And that's where a lot of my friends are. So about once a week, we get this question about worship, and the thing that I always go back to, because it was a big adjustment for me and my wife Kayla, moving here. The thing that I always go back to is something that you taught in a series on this we did forever ago, a year ago, I guess. But it's that when you do sing a cappella, you can hear other people singing. Mm-hmm. So, the church we came from, you couldn't hear people around you. You could hear the band and maybe some people in like the direct area, but until the band kind of dialed down, they might have a cappella section or whatever. You couldn't hear everybody singing together.
Right.
And so I think that the evidence or the reasoning that I give to them is that I kind of start like Peyton. Like, I don't think that it's sinful. I still really enjoy worshiping with wind instruments.
Yeah.
But the benefit that I see to worshiping a cappella is that you can physically, very clearly hear everyone singing.
Yeah.
Even people that don't sing very well.
Yeah.
Whereas at a church with louder instruments and music stuff, they would say you can sing as loud as you want because nobody's going to hear you. Whereas, it's kind of the reverse philosophy of like everyone's going to hear you and everybody wants to hear you.
Yeah.
And what it does for me is, especially in a church, we're a fairly small church. We know these people that are singing with us. We know who's battling cancer this Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
We know who's just lost a family member. We know who's struggling to get their spouse to church and whose kid is wayward right now. And like we know all of these very difficult situations that people are going through, and yet they're here and they're worshiping and we hear them. And so it's hard for me to come in with all the problems that I have in my life on a Sunday morning and sing a worship song or praise or whatever words you want to use, but sing and hear these other members in our church that have way bigger issues going on than me that I know about singing and feel like and not immediately feel like the things that I'm dealing with are just not that important anymore, and also not immediately be encouraged by the fact that these people that have been pursuing God for a lot longer than me are here and they're still singing and they're still pursuing Him, And so
for sure.
So I think for me that's the strongest case for singing a cappella is you get that. Admonishing is a good word. You get that encouragement from the body of knowing that they're not just sitting through this thing waiting for the song to end so they can hear the message and leave. Like they're participating. Yeah. Even when I know a lot of them don't feel like it. Maybe I don't feel like it.
Right.
But they're going to hear me if I'm not singing.
Yeah.
So I gotta start singing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and we talked about a little bit earlier that the biblical or the New Testament certainly call of singing is that we sing to one another. And so, like Caleb's saying, it's a prudential thing for us, like both of you guys have said. It's a pragmatic thing. We think it's the best way to accomplish what we want singing to accomplish, what singing is meant to accomplish. We don't think it's the only way to do it. We don't think it's sinful to do it any other way. But if we're meant to sing so that we admonish each other and encourage each other, then we think the best way to do that is for other people to be able to hear you. Like I remember several times where someone had lost a person that they loved, some just brutal. And they were there the next Sunday, and I could look at them while they were singing and see tears coming down their eyes as they were singing "In Christ Alone, My Hope Is Found" or whatever we were singing that day. And I don't remember anything else from that Sunday, but I remember that and how much that moved me. And so, along with that, we keep the lights up so you can see each other. All we're hearing is voices, and so you're hearing each other sing. It allows you to do that. So the congregational aspect, which is again, it's foundational, communal. It's not primarily a time for me to come and have my one-on-one time with God. It's me to come and have time with God and His people, with the full communion of God. And so singing a cappella allows us to do that and to hear all of our brothers and sisters, like Caleb is saying, to see them if we keep the lights up like we do generally here. That there are benefits aimed at what it seems like singing in the Bible is aimed at, that's accomplished more in that avenue than it is with some other avenues. In our opinion. Peyton, any thoughts on that?
Nothing really I could add to that, other than just it. To me, it's sad that we have to make these qualifications. I wish that I didn't have to have that list in my head. That there was just an understanding.
Qualifications.
Yeah, there's just an understanding that we all love God. We all want to worship God, and some of us have different ways of doing that. It doesn't necessarily mean those ways are wrong.
And we love Church of Christ, and obviously we're in one. But one of the downsides of our past we have drawn lines more sharply than any other denomination has. That's truth, right? We have drawn lines of fellowship, of brotherhood more sharply than anyone. And so the price of that is now we have to qualify out our ears every time we have a conversation and say, well, yep. When other people from other denominations can say, we disagree about this. Here's why I think it's best to worship God this way. Here's why you think it's best to worship God this way. But we're disagreeing as brothers. We have to start our conversations with, well, first of all, I think you're my brother. First of all, this is just a disagreement about opinion.
Yeah.
It's just about how we can best glorify God. It's just about prudentialness. It's not about salvation. So the great reverse, instead of being the non-denominational, where it's Christians only, but not the only Christians, instead of being that, we became our whole sectarian thing, and so now we're paying the price for that. Where
We collective, you're saying we as if,
Church of Christ
we,
history, the whole of Church of Christ, that we have to qualify a lot more than anybody else has, and I get it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody that's in the Church of Christ now blames anyone for asking.
Right.
I was in a group.
I don't even let them ask half the time. I just started with that.
Yeah.
Well, how's Church of Christ? I don't think you're going to hell.
I was in a small group the other day, and one of the guys in the group he went through like a rehab center with a Church of Christ, and I said something about working at a church, and he asked, which I didn't know you work in a church now. Like, which one is it? I told him I had Church of Christ, and he goes, "Huh? What do they think about you being there?" I was like, "Well, it's different than what you're expecting," and I went through the whole spiel like I tend to do. So then I go like, "Well, are we even a Church of Christ? Like, what does that even mean really anymore?"
Yeah.
So
Christians have ever since the Protestant Reformation, even before then, have discussed what is the best way for us to do the ecclesia, for us to assemble, to glorify God. We're just part of that discussion. Let us just be part of that discussion. We're not over here saying we've got the right answers in every regard. We just want to be part of the discussion about those things, and hope we can be. Any closing statements from the closet Calvinist,
that is going to be so loud.
cage Calvinist, cage stage Calvinist, or the Church of Highlands Pentecostal, Church of God Assembly of God,
Yeah.
Assembly of God Pentecostal Highlands are over there.
I think the more that we study Scripture, but not just Scripture, also the different ways of understanding worship in church. The more that we study other people and their arguments, their points, the more humility it
Oh,
creates.
man, preach.
Because
preach.
if we all had humility, we'd all be able to come together.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like those guys over there are just doing what they want to do for fun.
They
They're
just wanna-
they're just
they're
doing what
doing
they.
Or that they're trying to mislead thousands of people.
Right.
I think that's a common, like, especially when you get into mega churches. And admittedly, some mega churches have done a very poor job with the amount of people that have come through their doors,
Yeah.
in my opinion. But I think a lot of times you look at a big church and you think, well, they're doing something. There's no way that many people want to follow Jesus, so
Yeah.
they must be doing something. They must be plotting to take over the world or whatever. I think that my sum up of worship is better. Is better. The more people that we can have worshiping God and praying to God, the better we are off as a world and as a community and as a church. And I think that the goal is to worship in spirit and truth, and I think the responsibility we have as people who worship God is to make sure that the things we do in worship, whether it's singing or otherwise, are done to the best of our knowledge scripturally and
Truth.
speaking things that are actually true about God.
Yeah.
That the Bible actually says. And I think if you're there, it's like play a djembe, or what's another obscure instrument, a harp or a lyre, or a didgeridoo, whatever it is. Or don't play anything and just sing. But But I mean, if you're worshiping, you're worshiping. And I think everybody's going to think their way is better because it's their way.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And that's just who we are. That's the humility thing that we got to work on, I think. And we're going to get to heaven, and there's going to be some sort of instrument that nobody's ever heard of. And everyone's going to be like, I thought it was my way. God's going to be like, no, it's my way. So.
Yeah,
There's the old joke that St. Peter's walking somebody around heaven and he's showing different rooms, and he shows in the Baptist room there's a potluck, and the Methodist room there's, I don't know, a baby getting sprinkled, and then he shows the Church of Christ room and he says, "Be quiet. They think they're the only ones here." Yeah, that's us. All right, good stuff. Yeah, we've got a list. We've got a list of topics that we want to talk about. Some exciting and cultural things. But if you have something you want to talk about, let us know, and we'll put it on the list and get to it.
Like a live stream Q&A is in order, probably.
I'm definitely down to do that. That'd be a lot of fun. So yeah, we can't speak for all churches of Christ when it comes to these things. We speak for ourselves. We sing without instruments here because we think it's the best way to accomplish what the Bible says about singing, to encourage and admonish one another, to lift one another up. But we definitely don't think it's the only way that it's simple to do it otherwise. We think there's good cautionary fences to put up when it comes to worship to keep us from emotionalism and to keep us sinking truth into our hearts as opposed to anything else, and to not identify that emotion as God himself, but to identify God as who he is, to worship the true God and not end up worshiping just a version of ourselves that we enjoy. Next week, talk to you later.